I'm here with Leah, Khan Academy's Hey, this is Kim, and I'm here with Leah, Khan Academy's U.S. Government and Politics Fellow. Welcome, Leah.
How's it going?
All right, so we're talking about the Articles of Confederation, which I think many people don't realize was the first Constitution of the United States before the one that we have now since 1789. So could you take us through a little bit what the Articles of Confederation were and the context in which we first brought them on as a governmental system?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to understand about the Articles of Confederation and why we would talk about this is because one of the biggest debates that we have in our history is about the balance of power between the federal government and state governments. When the Articles of Confederation were first created, it was in the middle of the American Revolution. They were created in 1777. And so the question becomes, well, how can we run a government that looks as different from monarchy as possible?
Right, so they're trying to run away from the past that they're getting away from in the Revolutionary War and trying to create a separate government that doesn't have any of those abuses that they are rebelling against.
If they're running away from monarchy, what they're running towards...
Khan Academy's U.S. Government and Hey, this is Kim, and I'm here with Leah, Khan Academy's U.S. Government and Politics Fellow. Welcome, Leah.
How's it going?
All right, so we're talking about the Articles of Confederation, which I think many people don't realize was the first Constitution of the United States before the one that we have now since 1789. So could you take us through a little bit what the Articles of Confederation were and the context in which we first brought them on as a governmental system?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to understand about the Articles of Confederation and why we would talk about this is because one of the biggest debates that we have in our history is about the balance of power between the federal government and state governments. When the Articles of Confederation were first created, it was in the middle of the American Revolution. They were created in 1777. And so the question becomes, well, how can we run a government that looks as different from monarchy as possible?
Right, so they're trying to run away from the past that they're getting away from in the Revolutionary War and trying to create a separate government that doesn't have any of those abuses that they are rebelling against.
If they're running away from a monarchy, what they're running towards is what we would call a limited government.
Okay.
So their central government, which is synonymous with a federal government, central government is actually really, really small. They don't have an executive branch. They only have Congress. They don't even have the judicial branch. So Congress is made up of all 13 states. Every state had one representative. Okay. In order to change the Articles of Confederation, if they wanted to pass an amendment, they had to get unanimous consent from all 13 states.
Okay, so they're trying to make sure that all of the states are represented equally, but that also sounds like it would have a lot of hurdles to overcome when it comes to getting consensus.
Yeah, for laws, you had to get 9 out of 13 states to actually pass a law. So if you can imagine, if you're in a room of 13 people and you all have to agree on one pizza topping for the rest of your lives, it would be almost impossible, right?
Okay. All right. So it sounds like there are some problems with the Articles of Confederation, but did they do anything good for us in this early period?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is that it unites all 13 colonies who are now states under one government.
Okay.
This government is able to pass a really favorable treaty with Britain and end the Revolutionary War in 1783, the Treaty of Paris.
Okay, so this is kind of the government that gets us through the Revolutionary War and is with us when we first start in the 1780s.
Yeah, and one other specific law that they pass is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this Northwest Ordinance kind of tells us how we are going to expand as we move west and what are we going to do with that land. And that's a really important idea when we're moving forward with our country. The only problem is with the Articles of Confederation is there is a lot of things that we still have to figure out as we're growing. There's a lot of growing pains.
So, what led the early government of the United States to realize that they wanted to abandon these Articles of Confederation in favor of a different constitution?
So the inciting incident is Shays' Rebellion. It happens in Massachusetts, and it's a group of farmers led by this guy named Daniel Shays. What's happening is that we had just gotten out of the Revolutionary War, and a lot of the people who had fought in the Revolutionary War still hadn't gotten payment for their duty. They also were experiencing really high state taxes. So Daniel Shays and these farmers are very upset, obviously, and they're wanting their money, and so they start a rebellion. But the problem is with the way that the central government that was built. First, Congress had no ability to levy or collect taxes. They couldn't collect taxes, they had no ability to actually pay back their farmers. Along with that, they didn't have any money to create a military. So each state had their own militia.
No, 6.
The United States as a whole, as a country, did not have a military to suppress this rebellion. So on both ends, we are in a really bad situation politically.
Wow, so there's this moment where you find armed rebellion against the United States for lack of money, and the U.S. government finds that it can't raise money and it can't raise an army to put down this rebellion.
Exactly. And so there is this fear immediately. And what we see is a lot of the founding fathers that we know and really respect today, like George Washington and Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they get together and they say that this is a problem. We need to change what we have. This leads to the Constitutional Convention, in which we draft. It's our second constitution.
Right, yeah. So in 1787, the leaders of the United States get together and say, all right, the Articles of Confederation aren't working. We're going to need a stronger central government, even though we were trying to get away from the monarchy. And now let's think of something that's going to work a little bit better for us.
Talking about the Constitution, but the Constitution was not the first founding document of the United States. What were the Articles of Confederation, and why did they need to get replaced?
Well, the Articles of Confederation were the first loose set of rules to govern these 13 states, but they were a mess. Essentially, they allowed the states to be kind of their own little sovereign islands. So it was not a united nation. It was like an archipelago of islands. And the reason they were a mess, a couple of things. One, when they tried to repay the Revolutionary War soldiers, Congress in Washington, with very little power, had to go to the states and say, please give us some money so we can repay the soldiers. A lot of the states said, no thank you, we're not going to do that. Then if you had a river that rolled through several different states and you wanted to have a trade agreement with the Spanish, for example, to use that river and trade along it, then the government didn't have one way to negotiate with the Spanish. Individual states had to do it, and individual states had different interests. Some wanted to trade with the Spanish, some didn't want to trade at all. And so you had to, how do you get those states to agree on something? There was also not universal coinage. The states all made their own money and differently. Well, the states might print a bunch of money in order to pay off some debts, and then the money in one state is worth less than the money in another. Who regulates all of that? So commerce and industry and self-defense, there was no way to raise an army and pay for it. So the nation was crumbling before they got to Philadelphia in 1787.
And to your point, in most countries, the parts of the country are called things like provinces, but ours are states because they viewed themselves as individual countries.
Absolutely. And because, of course, the Articles of Confederation had been formed in the wake of this fear and the experience of the fear of a monarchy. So they wanted personal liberty and get the monarchy and national control, throw it all away, because they believed that once you consolidate control in a national government of any kind, that it would trample liberty. And so, after having fought a revolution for the purposes of liberating the people, you're not going to design a government that then stomps down on that liberty. So they created something that gave the states lots of flexibility, and then that flexibility allowed everybody to go off in their different directions.
So Articles of Confederation may be too much independence for the individual states. So it seems like there's consensus to fix it. What was the central debate when they decided to fix it?
Well, there was a consensus it had to be fixed, but when they got to Philadelphia, first of all, Rhode Island was invited and said no thank you. So 12 of the 13 states showed up. And they knew they wanted to centralize things, but what did that mean? And did it mean one president or a council of presidents? Did it mean a strong Congress? How strong? Could they tell states what to do? Well, if they did that, then they were acting just like George III had acted. So they had to iron out all of these issues to bring enough central control and enough quick movement of government that it could address national problems, but not so much that it trampled and stomped on that liberty. And that was the constant debate, constantly trying to figure out how to keep the balance between giving enough national power but enough liberty. And that, some of the biggest fights included fights over slavery, North versus South, fights over big states versus small states. Who has representation in this national government, and how do you figure that out? And then, of course, the question of, do we want a president? Will it be a single person? And how the dickens do we elect that person? Which led us to the Electoral College, which has had some bumpy history.
And where do you think we ended up? If on a scale of 0 to 10, if 0 was a complete, independent states, and 10 is a federal government that just controls everything, where do you think the U.S. Constitution ended up relative to the Articles of Confederation?
Well, in September of 1787, when it gets September 17th, 1787, when the new Constitution gets voted on, it is a stronger national document that has basically three main parts. One, the people are at the heart and center of it. It is the people who are the representatives or are the center of the Republican government. The second thing is that the national government can tell states what to do in some instances. Those instances are circumscribed, but it can happen. The states have to fall in line. That was very new. And there is this thing called a presidency, which is created, a single person, created really in the mold of George Washington. So it is a nationalized government, but with a strong attention to this question of protecting liberty through a balance of power system, so that both the national government has checks and balances, and also the relationship between the federal government and the state government has a number of checks and balances. So even though they went in a more centralized direction, they were constantly attentive to this idea of liberty, keeping it free in the states, and not messing with them too much in their effort to get some kind of centralized control.
It sounds like they might have gone from a 1 or 2 with the Articles of Confederation to maybe a 7, 6.
Well, I think they went from a 1 or 2 to maybe a 5 or a 6, which has now moved, over time, closer to maybe an 8 or 9.
In the United States today, we know our system of government so well that it hardly bears thinking about. We know that there's a president who's the head of the executive branch. There's Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And there's the judicial branch, which has the Supreme Court as its head of a whole court system that stretches throughout the United States. But how did the United States end up with this system? We frequently forget that the Constitutional Convention, which created this system we know today, happened in 1787. That was more than a decade after the Declaration of Independence. So there was this 11-year plus period before the United States had its modern day constitution. And during that time, fought the Revolutionary War, won in 1783, and tried out a completely different system of government called the Articles of Confederation, which we talked a little bit more about in another video. Now, the Articles of Confederation had a very strong sense of limited government. In fact, you could think of the Articles of Confederation as being a little bit more like a loose confederation of states, where each state had one vote in the legislative branch, the branch that makes laws, and they had to really agree on most things. 9 out of 13 for most legislation, and unanimous agreement for any kind of amendments to this system. And I think it's clear why the founders first went with this system of limited government, because they had just revolted against a monarchy. They thought of the states as being in what they call just kind of a league of friendship. You could almost see it as being similar to the European Union today. Independent nations who do some things together for foreign policy reasons and economic reasons. But by the late 1780s, it was becoming clear that the Articles of Confederation were not working. With such a weak central government, it was really hard to get things done. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't raise a military. Some states were even putting taxes on the goods of other states. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island did not participate because Rhode Island was not a big fan of central government, came together in Philadelphia, in the same place where they had signed the Declaration of Independence, to think about how to revise the Articles of Confederation. And some very notable figures were there. George Washington was one of them. See Ben Franklin over here, and James Madison. Although some people that you might have expected to be at the Constitutional Convention were not, namely Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who were out of the country being diplomats at the time. So the delegates at the Constitutional Convention have a pretty difficult problem to solve. They want to have a stronger central government, one that can get things done, make sure the states play well together, raise armies, raise taxes. But they don't want a central government that is too strong, because they just escaped from monarchy. They don't want to recreate monarchy in the United States. So they're looking for a very delicate balance of a government strong enough to get things done, but not so strong as to promote tyranny. Now, even though the delegates were supposed to be revising the Articles of Confederation, some people had in secret been considering completely throwing out the Articles of Confederation and starting anew. But one of the biggest hurdles they had to solve was, what would a new sort of legislature look like? So the Virginia delegates suggested a plan for the legislature, the lawmaking body, that would be bicameral. Means 2 room or 2 house, from bi meaning 2, and camera, Latin for room. And their idea was that there would be a lower house, similar to the House of Commons in English Parliament, that would be directly elected. Because individuals would vote for the representatives, but the number of representatives that each state would get would be decided by their population. Now, Virginia was the largest state by population by far, and so this plan would have worked out pretty well for them because they would have gotten the largest proportion of representatives. Small states like Delaware and Georgia, Rhode Island, would have very few representatives indeed, comparatively. They also wanted to have an upper house, similar to the House of Lords in the British Parliament, which would be appointed by state legislatures. But just like the lower house, the number of representatives would also be determined by population. Now, as you can imagine, the small states were not big fans of having representation based just on population. So they came back with a different plan. This was called the New Jersey Plan. So the little states said, all right, the Virginia plan gives way too much power to the big states. We want an equal voice in legislation. So the New Jersey Plan, much like the Articles of Confederation, gave one vote to each of the states, so that the small states would have the same representation in Congress as the large states. And their plan was for a single chamber or a unicameral legislature. So this really wasn't much different from the Articles of Confederation at all. So how did the delegates resolve this issue of how to balance the voices of large states with large populations with small states that had small populations?
Quit bouncing that chair, please.
Because in a situation where all states have an equal number of votes, like in the New Jersey plan, the 60,000 residents of Delaware could have as much say as the almost 700,000 residents of Virginia, meaning that the people who lived in Delaware were, in effect, more powerful. But at the same time, you wouldn't want it so that people living in the larger states could get their way all the time. What if the people in Delaware had a very legitimate concern that those in Virginia didn't share? It would be impossible.